Samantha Agarwal, I had the great opportunity to meet last year at, was it Social Sciences History? Was it LSA or ASA? ASA, okay, American Sociological Association meeting. And I was really intrigued by your work and then excited to learn that you were in our neck of the woods, at least for a while, at American University, so just across the Potomac there, where currently she is a changemaker postdoctoral fellow. She holds an MA and a PhD in sociology from Johns Hopkins, so that's where I was going to Hopkins also in Maryland, and a BA in political science and environmental policy from the Ohio State University in Ohio, from our sibling state to Wisconsin, my home state. Prior to becoming an academic, she worked for 5 years with indigenous land and labor movements in central India. And she's currently involved in and a co-founder of the Cornerstone Project, which trains groups here in the DMV area and beyond in the fundamentals of grassroots organizing. So it is my profound pleasure to welcome you here to George Mason University's campus, and looking forward to your talk very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here. And thank you to Ben and Gabriel and Dawn for making this happen. And I really appreciate all of you joining me today. So my presentation is going to be based on my book project, which is broadly about the rise of Hindu nationalism and the Hindu supremacist Bharatiya Janata Party, or the BJP, which is the world's largest ethno-nationalist movement and party. And this is actually the first time that I'm going to be presenting about this. Oh.
Making sure that we're sharing, because I did not set it up for you. There we go. And apologize.
No worries. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah,
okay.
Sounds good.
All right. Title disappeared. That's okay. Not sure how. Oh, there we go. Okay, good. So yeah, this is a slice of my book project. And this particular piece I haven't yet shared with anyone yet. So this will be really great to, talk about it and hear your feedback, your thoughts. So I'd be really grateful to, hear any suggestions you have for improvement. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A. So I'll be focusing on the Indian state of Kerala, which is the red area over there, and the blue area is India. And within Kerala, most of my research takes part in the southern district of Thiruvananthapuram, also known as Trivandrum. And Trivandrum is also the home of Kerala's capital city. It's also named Trivandrum. And anyone who knows about Kerala or has studied Kerala knows that the state is extremely unique on multiple fronts. So for example, the term the Kerala miracle was coined in the 1970s to refer to the state's extraordinarily high levels of human development, despite relatively low economic growth rates. And moreover, Kerala is one of the few states where left-wing political parties and movements have had a substantial presence at the state level. And in fact, they've been dominant or hegemonic at the state level for more than 60 years. And some argue that this leadership still persists to this day. And further, under the leadership of the Communist Party of India, the CPI, and also later the Communist Party of India Marxist, the CPIM, the state established far-reaching networks of social security and direct welfare entitlements, substantially raising the quality of life for the urban poor, and especially in the areas of health and education. Kerala is also one of only a handful of states in all of India where the proto-fascist Hindu supremacist BJP, which is dominant at the national level and has been dominant since 2014, has been unable to make substantial inroads at the state level. And so far, the BJP has only ever won a couple of seats in the state legislature. And I thus think of Kerala as a limit case. So what I mean by that is that Kerala is a case where the BJP's growth is most unlikely in all of India. it's most difficult in a certain sense. At the same time, as I'll show you, the BJP has also in recent years made inroads at the local level in Kerala. So that was kind of scary. And so part of this talk will be aimed at explaining that phenomenon. Why is the BJP making inroads at this local level when at the state level, the state has been considered hostile to the BJP. So coming to the focus of your class this week, Kerala is also well known for another important political milestone, and that is the successful decentralization of its state bureaucracy. And that took place under the rubric of the Kerala People's Plan Campaign of 1996, or the PPC for short. The PPC was the sort of brainchild of a newly elected left-wing coalition comprised of various left parties or communist parties, which had come to power in Kerala in that same year. The PPC was proposed most immediately as a kind of response to over a decade of economic stagnation and fiscal crisis beginning in the 1980s. The idea was that decentralization could ostensibly cut costs and also improve efficiency in service delivery, while also strengthening local democracy. And so through the PPC, the state managed to devolve 35 to 40% of the state's development budget down from a centralized bureaucracy to local governments. In rural areas, that's the village, block, and district levels, and then in cities, it's municipalities and wards as well. At these local levels, the idea was that people would determine and implement their development priorities. And indeed, this process initially garnered the involvement of large numbers of people. Some estimate it at 100,000 people in the initial years of the PPC, taking part in this deliberative process. However, it's also well known that in the years after the left government exited from power in 2002, the local participation and local mobilization substantially dropped off and actually never really returned to the same levels that it did under the first left front coalition. This will be important later. You'll understand the importance of this later in the presentation. And so, according to the literature, some of the successes of the PPC include its creation of participatory publics with a high degree of social inclusion. That also includes socially vulnerable and marginalized groups, and also positive development outcomes, including in childcare, health, housing, and the construction of infrastructure, including roads. And this was particularly reported in the first 5 years following the inauguration of the People's Plan Campaign. Okay. And so in this research, I am asking the following questions. How is the far-right BJP leveraging a framework for development that's ostensibly progressive framework that was originally put into place by the left? Second, how exactly does the BJP's involvement in these local self-governing bodies, or LSGs, translate to greater support for this far-right party? And in that too, I'm looking at the capital city of Trivandrum, as I mentioned, where the left has historically had a substantial presence, and especially among poor and marginalized groups. And here you can just see a BJP poster that I snapped a picture of that was in one of the local ward councilors' offices, advertising free COVID vaccines, along with a picture of one of the local BJP party members on the right. And in the middle, you see Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India and the leader of the far-right party. Okay, so in answering these questions, I draw from a range of methodological tools, and primarily I did field work in Trivandrum, in the urban, what are called colonies. So this term generally refers to planned residential areas or neighborhoods, and the majority of the people in these neighborhoods are from the historically marginalized caste group known as Dalits. And I'll talk more about colonies in a moment. I also drew on 200 qualitative interviews, which I conducted across Kerala beyond Trivandrum, and also extended ethnographic observations in one of such colonies, which I call AKG Nagar, that's a pseudonym. And lastly, I conducted a household survey of 600 households across 20 different colonies in the capital city of Trivandrum. Okay, so before I lay out the argument here, I just wanted to share a brief, few words about the colonies, right? This is the context in which this fieldwork took place, right? And so under British rule, this term colony referred to any planned settlement created by the state for any purpose, and it could consist of any demographic. But after the formation of Kerala, colonies gradually came to be associated with members of the lower caste, and particularly Dalits. And the word Dalit refers to those who belong to the lowest caste in the Indian caste hierarchy. So in 2010, the Kerala government estimated that 80% of the state's more than 3 million Dalits lived in 50,000 colonies spread across the state of Kerala. In a household survey, I found that 70% of my 500 randomly selected respondents who answered this question in Trivandrum's urban colonies identified as Dalits. Compare this to the only 12% of Trivandrum's wider population that identifies as Dalits. This fact shows the spatial concentration of Dalits in these urban spaces. And really, despite high levels of literacy and the above average educational attainment of these residents, the vast majority of people in the colonies remain on the margins of Kerala's urban economy. For example, in my ethnographic field site, AKG Nagar, only 5% of the 50 families that I surveyed there were employed in long-term or permanent positions, such as in the government or in the service sector. A small portion owned petty capital, such as auto rickshaws or family-run restaurants or food stalls, only 2%. And most residents had jobs with irregular and meager salaries, overwhelmingly in the informal sector. And their occupations included being porters, welders, painters, or construction workers. 58% of them reported being unemployed for 6 or more months in the past year. These precarious conditions of work mean that upward mobility, including saving up money to move out of the colonies into more middle class or mixed caste neighborhoods, is squarely out of reach for most of the colony's residents. Many of the residents are also over indebted. My average respondent was in debt by 301,000 rupees, approximately twice the household average debt for urban areas in India. And the most common reasons for assuming loans was for home repairs, but also for other day-to-day living expenses, like medical bills, children's education, or marriage. Almost none of these loans were for income-generating activities. Very important. Finally, a word on housing insecurity. 89% of my respondents reported experiencing 86% of my respondents reported experiencing some form of housing insecurity, especially substandard conditions of their physical home. Right? And so this finding is very much in line with a 2017 report by the Kerala state government, which stated that, quote, the majority of Dalit houses are dilapidated, unfit for residents, and having inadequate spaces and facilities. And these findings further resonate with macro level data which show that while poverty on the whole may have declined in Kerala, inequality between Dalits and non-Dalit people increased substantially during the last 2 to 3 decades, and including in the post-decentralization period. This fact is most sharply reflected in the colonies. Okay, so on to my argument. Based on those extended observations in the colonies, I argue that participatory planning is, first of all, only as egalitarian as is the society more broadly. So while the literature shows that Dalits and women have participated in these local institutions to a very high degree, especially in the initial years, it's clear that they were unable to utilize these local bodies to address longstanding caste and gender-based inequalities. In fact, as I'll show, some of these inequalities are even reproduced and reinforced through these institutions. Second, participatory planning is only as empowering as people are politically organized. I'll argue that the Achilles heel of Kerala's PPC is the fact that it was implemented just as the left was in the process of depoliticizing social welfare and brokering a class compromise for labor. So while the program did start with massive investments in people's power, that gradually tapered off, as I mentioned earlier. Not everyone in the party agreed with this approach. And also not everyone in the opposition party, the Congress party and their coalition agreed with this approach. In fact, the majority of them opposed it. And so after the left was voted out of office in 2001, they essentially allowed for the mobilizational politics of decentralized governance to collapse. And this, as we'll see, leads to cronyism and ultimately obstructs the developmental goals of the state. And finally, in contrast to what some commentators have argued, participatory planning is not a neutral process. It's not necessarily progressive either. Rather, it's only as progressive as are the parties who organize the people within them. So right now, as the far-right BJP is increasingly embedding itself in these local bodies, they're also taking on an increasingly far-right character and composition. And I'll elaborate on some of these points in a moment. So the first major finding is that residents in the colonies face a number of obstacles, technical and substantive obstacles to accessing welfare programs, despite the, the inclusive and participatory goals of the PPC. One of the biggest obstacles to development is the lack of titles, or patayams as they're called in Kerala. And the reasons for this, I can talk more about in the Q&A if you're interested, but the titles are very important in terms of accessing various social welfare programs. In virtually every colony that I visited, and not just AKG Nagar, residents shared eclectic stories of getting locked out of the welfare state when attempting to secure desperately needed subsidies, not only for home renovations, but also for other critical resources. As Ajay, a resident in a colony in northern Trivandrum, put it, because we don't have patayams, we are unable to get funds to build a home, to get water connections, electricity. The conditions here are really bad. People are living in temporary sheds made from aluminum sheets. We have to walk down a hill to bring water in a bucket from a communal tap, indicating that they don't have running water in their home. Additionally, flooding, poor quality of roads, overcrowding, and lack of space for recreation and ceremony are also major issues that residents repeatedly mentioned and also said are chronically unaddressed by the local self-government bodies. And so, you can kind of forget about more ambitious income-generating activities. These aren't really even part of the agenda at this point, right? The basic amenities like housing, like roads, like sanitation are not being adequately procured through the LSTs. And I witnessed this in many different colonies across the city. And this is a larger systemic issue, which is in part linked to the fact that the LSGs don't challenge the basic logic of caste segregation or the logic of the colonies. In fact, they replicate it. So the welfare schemes that are utilized through these bodies are meant to reproduce the colonies, right? Not to get people out of the colonies. And in fact, there have even been in the last couple of decades initiatives to create new colonies through the LSGs, which is not a widespread phenomenon because Kerala faces chronic shortage of land, but it does show that the LSGs are not necessarily thinking critically about the way that caste is being replicated within these urban spaces, which is a major problem. So in short, the LSGs have been unsuccessful at enabling marginalized groups to resist their exclusion from various vital resources and also from general caste equality. My second finding is that corruption by elites coupled with a lack of grassroots agency hampers development outcomes. And one very clear illustration of this is the MLA scheme, as it's called in Kerala, which at the time amounted to about $500,000 US that an MLA or state legislator could allocate to the LSGs, specifically for the improvement of the Dalit colonies. And while conducting ethnography in AKG Nagar, residents recalled a story about how in 2012, the then CPIM MLA, the Shivam who you can see in this photo, announced that he was sanctioning, a 1 crore or approximately $125,000 fund for the MLA scheme for the redevelopment of the colony. And following, they mentioned how they, followed this lengthy procedure outlined in the state LSG policy, in which the MLA went and met with residents and members of the municipal corporation. And together they came up with a laundry list of various, improvements, material improvements that were most needed to benefit the colony. So those included the creation of a recreation center for colony youth, the revitalization of colony roads and boundary walls, among other things. And a budget that was then prepared, contractors were hired, the work started, and then, without explanation, these efforts were abruptly aborted. Nearly 10 years later, when I visited, the colony bears the remains of the MLA scheme, which is, now tarnished, right? So, or the promises of the scheme, which are now tarnished, including the discarded water harvest barrels, a fully constructed yet never operational waste incinerator, a stockpile of cobwebbed candlesticks that were once meant to help jumpstart a women's cottage industry, or a cottage industry for financially insecure women. And what I saw in the colony stood in stark contrast to a much rosier picture that was presented in the official files, which depicted the project as having been completed, every rupee having been allocated and accounted for in a timely and efficient manner. And what was perhaps most surprising to me about the story wasn't necessarily about the corruption, but it was about the residents' account as to how nobody really resisted this process. This resistance neither came from the rank and file nor from the Communist Party affiliated, workers, the cadres. In fact, I managed to track down 3 of the residents who were initially part of the local government body responsible for monitoring the implementation of the MLA scheme. And I asked them whether they or anyone else from the area intervened against this financial, misallocation. They all either passed the buck or pleaded ignorance. One of them blamed the MLA directly. And what these assessments made clear to me is that the local cadres and residents don't feel directly capable or responsible for carrying out these development initiatives, despite the people-centric vision that originally informed the concept of decentralization. Other residents, in fact, placed blame for the failed development for this project and also many others on the inaccessible and top-down left leadership that seemed impervious to the realities of the colony residents. And all of this was a glaring departure from the earlier periods that I can't get into here, but I'm happy to talk about later if you're interested. And the earlier periods were really characterized by this vibrant bottom-up politics, which characterized the colony life, not just the colony life, but also labor. And so it was really interesting to see not just in this just colony, but more broadly, people recalling earlier periods when they were actually active and holding elected officials accountable. But in this period, in the post-decentralization period, they weren't. And they, in fact, just attributed the outcomes of failed development to the higher ups. Okay, so my last finding here is about the way in which the BJP takes advantage of these various weaknesses and failures in the LSGs. And so specifically, I look at how these cadre, BJP cadre members channel a combination of federal and state funds to provide tangible goods that can be provided immediately and are relatively straightforward to deliver to colony residents. This includes both private goods that target individuals, such as cooking fuel and gas connections, toilets, electricity, housing, and bank accounts. And they also include more public goods that are for the larger community. So that includes road construction and repair, installation of streetlights, public sanitation. And this, both of these types of welfare provisioning have been very effective at winning over poor voters to the BJP, not only in Kerala, but also outside of Kerala across India. In providing these services to residents and strategically framing these interventions as a product of the Modi-led federal government, these cadres not only build support for the BJP by addressing local needs, but they also occupy a critical node in the larger BJP strategy to make inroads in the previously hostile terrain of Kerala. And so just a brief word about this pyramid is necessary to understand how precisely the BJP access and funnel material benefits to the colony residents. So you can see at the top of the pyramid, there's a small group of politicians, both at the federal and state level. These state level politicians then work with national party figures to channel federal funds and welfare programs to the lower levels on this pyramid. In the middle part of the pyramid, there's a medium-sized group of BJP politicians that operate in the local governing bodies, particularly in the municipal corporations as ward councillors, and also in the village councils in the rural areas, the panchayats. And in Kerala, the BJP has seen a rapid expansion of the BJP and its power in these mid-level bodies. Through the LSGs, these councillors allocate resources to the people at the bottom of this pyramid, which are the cadres or the party workers working at the colony level. And these cadre members, many of whom were actually once former supporters of the left, live or have lived in these colonies for many years, and thus are intimately familiar with the most pressing material challenges that they face. And so a district level BJP leader, his name is Biju, explained to me in an interview how each level of this pyramid synergizes to facilitate the party's expansion in the colonies. And at the heart of this process is what he calls the Vikasana Samiti, which translates to the Development Committee. And Biju said that one MLA can sponsor 2 colonies. Right now, the money is being channeled from O. Rajagopal, that's the name of the former BJP MLA, to the wards where the BJP are municipal councillors. At the grassroots, we have the Vikasana Samiti, the development committee. It's unique to the BJP. The other parties don't have anything like it. Members of the committee are cadre from both the BJP and other Samh Parivar affiliates. Samh Parivar is just a Hindu nationalist network. The committee comes together for meetings every month and discusses what development works have to be carried out in the colonies. This information is funneled to the councillors who help to direct funds where they need to go. At the grassroots, different people from the committees are assigned to monitor the developmental works regarding water, pensions, and so on. So essentially what Biju is describing is both the BJP's embeddedness in the LSG bodies, but also a kind of parallel operation, right? That is strictly for the party's activities, the party's members, and the party's recruitment. And the two of these sort of bodies interact to build BJP support in these areas. And I just have like a sort of schematic representation of that. The left one is actually from, oh, that is actually not showing up how it should. 1 second. Oh, there you go. Okay. Yeah, so the one on the left is actually from your reading from Harnacker. I'm not sure if you all still did that for this week, but yeah, so that's kind of just the schematic description of the LSGs. And this is my schematic description of the BJP's structure in the local government. And you can see that they, mirror each other in a certain respect. And mine is sort of mirroring the one that's on the right side, which is the urban structures. Okay, and I'll just give you one more example of how the BJP is working in these colonies. So one of the role of the BJP cadres is close coordination with the development committees, as Biju mentioned, right? And one of the pressing issues that they work to address is housing insecurity. So to this end, one of the programs that's most commonly accessed by these workers is through this housing subsidy program called Life Mission. And this is actually a program that was started by the left government and runs on a largely state-funded budget, but it also has some funding from the federal level. But as we saw in the previous slides, residents often encounter significant barriers when attempting to avail benefits through such programs. As such, the development committees of the BJP, and particularly colony level party members, like this one pictured on the far left, work tirelessly to iron out the wrinkles that that are in this sort of process. And so while they broker benefits through these programs, they strictly attribute any benefits allotted under the scheme to the federal Modi-led government, even though, as I just mentioned, it is a program that's largely funded by the state government. And here you can see, the BJP colony member, colony worker, on the left, along with two newly won over supporters of the BJP on the right. And on the far right side, you can see the freshly laid foundation for this couple's home that the BJP helped this family to avail using that program that I just mentioned. Okay, and here you can just see some more of the political work done by the BJP cadres and the councillors, namely to politicize these welfare programs, claim credit for them, and also advance a broadly Hindu nationalist political agenda. I can talk more about what that agenda looks like in the Q&A if you're interested in that aspect. But I should probably wrap up because I think I'm running out of time. So some broad takeaways from my findings. I do believe that it is possible to reinvigorate the LSGs and make them more democratic and accountable. But I think that is only going to be possible if the left deeply invests in long-term political mobilization, and also what I call cadrification, which just means building up local level leadership in the party and engaging them in addressing the most important and urgent needs of the local population. Additionally, if the LSGs are going to contribute to a more egalitarian form of development, the historic caste inequalities, which are still extremely prevalent in the Kerala context, must first, or at least simultaneously, be addressed through what I call caste-conscious redistribution. And for a more elaborate description or discussion of caste-based redistribution, you can check out my piece in Politics and Society from 2023. But more or less, to sort of simplify it, it's akin to what we think of as like race-based reparations in the United States. The LSGs are oftentimes argued to be politically neutral bodies that don't have political biases, and that they also involve people from a wide political spectrum. That may or may not be true, but what I find in my case is that this is a kind of idealized view of the participatory planning process, and it is in fact very political. And so I argue that in order to counter the influence of the far-right ethno-nationalist forces in these bodies, the left would benefit by actively engaging participants and residents in progressive political education, rather than treating these bodies as neutral spaces. And this is something that the left has to some extent started to do outside of the LSGs, more at the state level and through rallies and political programs and literature and things like that. But I argue that they also would benefit by doing this at the local level within these local self-governing bodies. Okay, I will leave it there and look forward to the conversation.
Incredible, and actually spoke directly to a conversation we were having in seminar right before you arrived. So I'm looking forward to this discussion. What I'm going to do is I'm going to suggest a couple things. Are you okay with me taking off the screen share?
Oh yeah, sure.
Let's do that. I'm going to adjust the camera here so that we're able to zoom out a little bit, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this other microphone. There we go. To make it possible to bring in some of the folks in the who are gathered here in person. And I'll just leave it to you if you'd like, or if you'd like me to take it, I can do it too. But I'll leave it to you to to just field the questions, and I'll just leave Phil Donahue here. So you can point to people and then also take questions from the chat and take people off of mute as you like, and take it from there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Joe.
Oh.
Yeah.
Hi. Okay, good. I was wondering, you alluded to this, but I was wondering what the social impacts of like the BJP more like entrenching themselves in Kerala society are. Like, are you seeing like more anti-Muslim bias or other effects of like the BJP social agenda or fascist agenda like more popularized in Kerala communities?
Should we respond to each one or let people?
Up to you.
Maybe let's have a few people talking.
I've seen an example of the sort of the trains run on time mentality in bags of rice, I believe it was, being delivered to homes with Modi's face printed on them, which is, of course, a part of the cult of personality around him in the BJP. Do the CPI and CPIM have any central figure they can rally around like that and associate results with?
And pardon me if this is a really silly question because I am monolingual, but does the word, pardon me, does the word colony resonate in the local dialect the same way colony and colonialism does in English? And does that history impact the people who are living in the colonies? And does that mindset impact the way those disparities affect those communities?
Let's maybe stick with that, and then there's one more in the chat, so we can maybe kick it back to you all. But yeah, these are wonderful questions, and maybe I'll start with the last one. Yeah, I was also a bit taken aback when I heard people, you know, who are residents in the colonies call them colonies, and I was like, is this a slur? Is this a pejorative term? Like, I felt really uncomfortable using it, and then I realized that that's actually how people in the colonies refer to, you know, their own place of residence. And so, you know, that's the reason why I use it. But, you know, it does have its origins in British colonialism. And so it's the English word, and, you know, but it sort of made its way into the Malayalam language in a certain sense. And so, yeah, but it's not said as a pejorative term. The majority of the times it's used, but then sometimes it actually is. You know, and usually that's like when, you know, for example, like the media is trying to, in some way, vilify the population living there, like other than, and there's a lot of that going on. I mean, you can probably imagine, you know, the way that like race is constructed in the United States and like racial segregation operates in the US, and how racial segregation is enforced through certain discourses and dialogues about racially marginalized people. So it's a similar thing. Like colony has come to signify those like, you know, ways of belittling or you know, targeting in some ways, like, you know, people who caste oppressed people who live there, who didn't have a choice whether to live there or not, right? And they're kind of stuck in this cycle of poverty and living in, you know, substandard living conditions and segregation. Yeah, so great question. And the question about central figures in the CPIM, I mean, I think it's a good question, and I understand perhaps where you're coming from. Like, BJP has very effectively wielded the figure of Modi, the charismatic leadership and authority of Modi to advance its agenda. And, you know, one might argue that someone like Modi was necessary in order to unite the disparate aspects of, or the different communities within the larger Hindu nationalist imaginary. At the same time, you know, your question about whether the left has anyone like that, I don't think they have anyone comparable to that. They do have their figures. Pinarayi Vijayan, you know, the chief minister of Kerala, like he did have you know, that kind of persuasion within Kerala, perhaps, but you know, whether that actually plays the same function in the left as Modi does for the right, it's not quite clear whether that's true, and also whether that's desirable. You know, I think that left, like one of the things that has actually given the left the strength that it does, or that it has today, is the fact that it does have this like vast network of civil society actors and bodies and groups that it has brought into its fold. And I think that is good. Like it bodes well for democracy and for you know, for participation. Like that's the whole topic of our discussion. So, you know, having this like, you know, central figure that people think of as kind of a hero or even like a god. I mean, I think some people think of Modi as a god, may be counterproductive to such goals. And yeah, I wonder about that, but it's an open question. And then there's a point here in the chat.
Oh, and then there was the question about,
I'm sorry, yes, of course, about like Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred, exactly, yeah. Thank you for that question. So it's a very good one, and I think one of the questions that I've had personally, watching the ways in which the BJP has grown and spread through these very sort of like seemingly apolitical channels, right? That's how, you know, the local government bodies are talked about, and that's how development is, you know, typically talked about. Is the question of like, well, where does the far right, where does the ethno-nationalist majoritarian agenda come in, right? And one of the findings, my findings, and it's echoed in some of the other, scholars who look at the BJP's growth, particularly among marginalized populations, is that it comes in very subtle ways. It's not as overt as it is in, upper caste communities and Brahmin communities who are the traditional supporters of the BJP, right? The strategy to really grow and spread among marginalized people, among Dalits, Adivasis, or tribal people of India. That is relatively that really happens in the mid 2000s, post 2004, and really gains a lot of momentum around then. And so, yeah, I think those groups have not been historically amenable to Islamophobia and some of these other more overt forms of Hindu chauvinism, right? And it makes sense that they would not be able to lead with that because, again, it's an upper caste party that espouses upper caste ideology that is directly at odds with the interests of marginalized caste people and Adivasi people in many ways. And so they appeal to them through things like welfare and through, building schools and healthcare facilities and things like that, and brokering welfare through the LSGs. And Islamophobia exists in society generally in Kerala. I mean, it has one of the largest populations of Muslims in the country, and there is a lot of unchecked Islamophobia in Kerala, as there is everywhere in the country. But I wouldn't say that that's a direct product necessarily of the BJP strategies and the LSGs. I think it's more more a product of the way in which the Hindu right has historically influenced Kerala's politics, even way before they started to enact some of these strategies that I was talking about. Sorry, that was long-winded. I'm not sure if that made any sense, but yeah. Let's go to the chat. Okay.
And I also see John Dale has a question in here as well. So there's a chat and then also a number.
The farmers' protests. I don't know if John wants to speak.
John Peck, do you want to speak to that directly?
Or
well, yeah, I could speak. I'm just involved with Via Campesina, and I know there's a lot of very large farmer groups in India that were involved in the recent farmer protests. I'm familiar with BKU and the Kerala Coconut Farmers Association myself, having met them at different Via Campesina events. But I was just curious what their role, as far as I know, they're nonpartisan and multicast. I guess I'm curious, but they're really involved in resisting this right-wing Hindu nationalism of Modi. I'm curious what role you see. Are they involved in any of this work in Kerala right now to try to push back against this or in other contexts? I guess that's my question. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they are directly involved in pushing back against Hindu nationalism per se, but the farmers' protests were probably the biggest setback that the Modi government experienced in the more than 10 years that they've been in power. And particularly because of the fact that they forced the Modi government to roll back the agrarian reforms, the pro-liberalization reforms that were being proposed by the Modi government, and forced him to retreat from that position and from that reform. So I think the farmers have a very significant role to play in fighting the Modi regime, fighting the sort of all-encompassing power of this regime. And there were some expressions of solidarity from Kerala as well. But as you probably know, the farmers' protests were very much located in the northern parts of India, specifically in the Green Revolution belt, Punjab, Delhi, to some extent Haryana. So less so in Kerala, but it's yet to be seen, whether the farmers across India can unite for a common platform to oppose authoritarianism and the kind of unleashing of market forces on India's poor people. So yeah.
Well, it's good to hear John Peck's voice. He's a farmer in Wisconsin, and
economist too.
Thank you. Samantha, you said that you think LSGs can be reformed by the left, but not without forging new pathways of political mobilization and codrification, especially caste-conscious codrification. You didn't say whether leaders in Kerala are seeing this as a problem they need to focus on in light of inroads that the BJP is making. When I was there, I guess last December, a year ago, a little over a year ago, I was there for a conference on cooperatives and digital platform cooperatives in particular, but it became pretty clear to us in Kerala that the cooperative movement is very strong and has been for a long time. You've emphasized welfare for the Dalit. What about forging a new pathway around incorporating them as part of the codrification into cooperatives? You mentioned in the household surveys that many of them were seeking employment. They had some skills, but they were chronically underemployed or worse, largely precariously. But some of these cooperatives that focus on bringing in marginalized populations could be a way to fight back against the kind of neoliberal policies that Modi has pursued for so long, and in a way that's still consistent with the goals of Kerala's left. Have you heard anything about that, or what do you think about that as an idea?
Well, you can probably speak more authoritatively than me since you were just there for the conference.
But I didn't stay in the colonies where you were, and I'm wondering, do you sense that Kerala is so divided, polarized, that they could never even consider,
Right.
Or that they couldn't work hard enough? Welfare is the best you can do for the Dalit. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the sentiment is. I thought you might have more insight.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it is something I've thought quite a bit about. Less about the cooperative economy model that the left front is trying to revive right now, and less so about the way in which the left is trying to reform itself in this present moment. But I have thought and researched and studied the ways in which the left has responded to defection by the lower caste members of former cadre and rank and file supporters of the left to opposition parties, including the BJP, and the way that the response has largely fallen along two lines. The way I think about it in my book is like one is elite recognition politics, and the other has been a sort of doubling down on the welfare model that neglects to address caste inequality. And so what I mean by elite recognition politics is, responding to this very particular threat of, Dalits increasingly voting for the BJP or, forming alliances with Hindu nationalist affiliated organizations or joining them. It has been the, left's formation of its own Dalit wing, the PKS, and that's a Kerala specific wing, but they also have a national wing. And the kinds of politics that the PKS has been advancing has been what I call elite recognition politics, and namely the sort of elevating of CPIM members who are Dalit to high-level positions, either in the government, like in the bureaucracy, or in the state administration, or as politicians. And essentially, the way that the respondents that I spent, a lot of time with and in the colonies responded to this was one of dismissal, and largely felt that this was a token measure rather than substantive recognition of their real sort of material deprivation and ongoing cycles of poverty. And the other part that I mentioned was the doubling down on the welfare model. Like, one of the things that a lot of like former cadres expressed as like a real sort of wish or hope for the left to reform itself was that the left would actually engineer a engagement with with the colonies, like a mass-based engagement with the local government bodies and specifically the colonies, embedding themselves in the colonies in the way that the BJP is doing, and taking note of the various problems, the various material issues and addressing them more actively. But when I brought these suggestions to the CPIM leadership, state level leadership, district level leadership, it was oftentimes met with just dismissal and just a failure to acknowledge the reality. And I found this very, very disheartening.
Does the BJP interact or engage the Dalit? Sorry, I'll say that again. Does the BJP engage the Dalit outside of Kerala and other parts of India where they already have inroads, or does this seem like an obvious effort to just capture the Dalit to make inroads in Kerala and then after that?
Do they engage Dalit people outside of Kerala?
Yeah, with the same kind
yeah.
of strategy. Yeah.
Oh yes, I mean probably much more forcefully in some places. Yeah. I mean, I think in other places they have had an easier time because there's been a history of BJP party support is more normalized, like in northern India, in Uttar Pradesh. There's been mass defection from rival parties to the BJP among the Dalit population in recent years, and part of it has to do with, again, like just the failures of liberal left parties to adequately enact a caste liberatory program, one which truly does away with caste inequality and addresses the material foundations of caste inequality, and also the discrimination that lower caste people face. Right, it's not just the material dimensions; it's the cultural discrimination that they're subject to. So the BJP, capitalizes on that. It's not to say that the BJP substantively addresses it or is in any way interested in abolishing caste. Absolutely not. But they are a cadre-based party. They have a mass presence in civil society, and so they're able to do things to address people's immediate interests that the other parties are not.
Hence your emphasis on Kerala as a limit case.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Figure there'd be one in the back there.
First off, thank you so much. And I was interested in land titles, and you're hoping you can elaborate on land titles. Specifically, do you believe giving back land titles is part of the caste conscious redistribution? Do you think it's essential?
Yeah. You preempted my book. Yes, that's one of the big, I think one of the big takeaways from the book. It's not done yet, so it will be one of the takeaways. But yes, I mean, I think, doing a second land reform, as many Dalits and Adivasis have been calling for many, many years, is absolutely essential to this. I mean, one of the things I look at is the ways in which the land reform that was enacted in the 60s into the 70s was one that in some ways, I mean, was obviously very progressive. It was the most far-reaching land reform in all of India. But at the same time, it prioritized as its primary beneficiary tenants. And tenants were historically members of the middle or slightly higher castes than Dalits. Dalits were considered a rank below tenants. They were considered agrarian laborers, agrestic slaves even. And so they were, essentially excluded from agrarian land reforms. In lieu of giving agrarian land to these people, they gave them these housing plots in colonies. And at the time, this is like probably getting a little too much into the weeds, but the logic of withholding these titles from the people who they allocated plots to in these colonies was that if you don't give people titles, they won't sell their land, like out of distress, and move away. But in the long run, this has created other problems we talked about. And some of them actually do have, or they did have titles they got titles sometime after the land reforms and after the housing plots were allocated several decades later, but they lost them through one mishap or the other. I mean, these are really small plots, right? And so you can imagine like a family, 5, like subdividing the plots across like 3 children, right? And the plot then shrinks, by like a third, basically, or like a third of that plot then becomes the possession of the next generation. And so that process of subdivision has also led to title insecurity because of the way that the bureaucracy works. I don't want to bore you all with the details of that, but yeah. What's that?
The opposite of generational wealth.
Right, yes. People are getting poorer generationally, yes, absolutely. And that's like not an easy problem to solve, but yeah, I do think that like second land reform would be one way of dealing with it, yeah.
Others here.
There was a hand over here in
Was
the
there?
middle. Yeah. The orange? No? Okay. I thought
Sure would have been
maybe it was
good.
a head scratch.
Anybody else? I mean, the conversation we were having prior to your talk today had to do with looking for lessons from Kerala for projects around popular participation here in North America and around particular kinds of strategies that are being pursued on the ground, like community wealth building and various approaches to building the solidarity economy and the relationship between models like Robin Hanel's democratic economic planning or participatory economics and practices like civic assemblies and participatory planning and projects like community wealth building, just to say, the sort of intensive integration of major institutions with community organizations and neighborhoods around a democratic economic development program. And then the question that we were discussing, and you guys were still debating when I came down here to set up, I think was had to do with this question of what breathes life into participation and what is required. And I had raised the question about organizational vehicles, whether they are labor unions or perhaps universities set in motion or political parties of various kinds. So I just wanted to draw that out because that is, obviously the question when we're looking at Mondragon or we're looking at, the Workers' Party in Brazil or cases from, Venezuela or the history of the kibbutzim and the cooperative movement within Palestine. These are the same kinds of questions. So I guess my question for you is, what is generalizable from Kerala that people who are looking to build a next political economy here in the US should take lessons from?
I think everyone in this room should answer that question, not just me. What do you all think from your readings then?
You started off pretty nice.
I see Cindy eager to answer that. Yeah? No?
I'm not ready to.
Okay, not ready. Who's ready?
God.
Got it. Okay.
But I was just going to read what you started with in your argument. That is, participatory planning is only as egalitarian as the society more broadly, only as empowering as the people are politically organized, and only as progressive as are the parties who organize people within. So, as general principles, I suppose those are the takeaways.
Yeah, there we go.
I feel like I spoke a lot, so you all should share.
It's always good when the thesis and the conclusion, yeah, right? Anybody else? No.
I guess I'm thinking more broadly as the left, honestly, because when we were learning about like the Kerala model itself, the preconditions of like anti-caste and other struggles for equality within Kerala, as part of kind of like the heritage that made like Kerala into like a red state. So I guess kind of like with that, and with this, like the dialogue that needs to happen between movements and an economy. And then, as you said, part of that being that you need to enrich the mobilization. So there's an effective dialogue there, I guess is what I'm thinking.
Yeah, great point.
I want to bounce back off of what John said and a comment I made earlier. We don't know each other, but I'm the happiest misanthrope you're ever going to meet. And while I truly believe that there is something to be said for, and our hope may lie in cooperative movements and participatory planning, you really need to have like-minded people work to that, and you cannot have one bad apple in the barrel, because they're going to skew your goals and they're going to take it down the wrong road, and then they're going to let Modi take over and everything's going to go haywire. Ultimately, I think in order to create a grander vision, you need to shore it up from being hijacked by a darker vision. And that's what we're struggling with today all across the world.
Thank you. And I see Aaron's hand, and maybe that will be the last one.
Yeah, so I just want to say that I agree with what Kat said. And also, I can't remember what reading it was, but one of the readings mentioned that when you're forming like a participatory planning committee, and it's more that you don't have people of like a like mind, that you have to incorporate people from all sides of, or all corners of the society. And I agree with what Kat said, and I think that if you have a group of people who agree with something, then there's one person who kind of has, I guess, a different perspective on it or a different approach to it, then it's going to make it slightly more difficult to achieve those cooperative goals. And at the time I was reading, I didn't really think about it like that. But at the time I was reading, I also thought, I was like, okay, that makes sense. You want to have like diverse perspectives. But I think my mind's been changed, because when you're trying to reach a cooperative goal and when you're trying to plan for the betterment of people in your community, or any community for that matter, it's important that you have people who have the betterment of the community in mind, and not, I guess, I'm trying to figure out how to say it. I guess not people who don't have the same goals in mind as everyone else in the committee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I just want to say, oh, is there another hand?
But there is, but I also
Yeah,
want to honor your time, and those at home, are you okay for one more?
Yeah.
Okay, and then people who are here online, I guess they can control their own space. Thank you, Aaron. That normative grounding that you were speaking to is important.
Thank you. I'll keep this brief. Really, I think with these kind of movements, the thing to consider, there has to be a core concept here. And that core concept is, does this make people's lives better? Now, these are, at the end of the day, these are tools. And we found these are tools to be more effective at helping people, but that is the core conceit. Does this make people's lives better? At a time in which standards are declining, how do we reverse that? And that is the most important part of these tools to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to just speak to the question about like what happens when there's disagreement in, the local bodies. And I'm definitely not trying to make the argument that local self-government can only succeed if there's political purism, right? That everyone has to believe the same thing, that there has to be homogenous, belief in certain ideas. I don't think that's what you all were arguing either, but I just want to remind you all of the diagrams that I showed of the BJP's approach. And I do think there are some things we can learn from the far right, as we're trying to figure out what to do next, right? So I showed like those two models, right? And the BJP's like pyramid and the local self-governing bodies, and how the BJP has their own sort of sphere of politics, which is the party and all of their affiliated organizations. They have hundreds of affiliated organizations that are explicitly human nationalist organizations. And they also intervene in this more neutral body, which is the local self-governing institutions. And so I think that is actually something to learn from, that you can have your your clarity about your vision, your views on things, with your people, right? And not everyone has to be part of that, right? But if you're clear on it, then you can effectively intervene in more democratic bodies that are actually meant to include everyone, including bad apples, right? Like you can actually be more effective at dealing with the problematic views that come up or views that seem to undermine the larger vision or the goals that you all set out to do. So I think that's actually one of my takeaways from the BJP, to be honest.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Agarwal, and thanks everybody for your contributions to this as well today. So please, a round of applause.